My name is Brooke Higgins, founder and lead instructor of Crosswalk Test Prep and Tutoring. The objective of this video is to give you the real of test optional, what test optional in the 2024-25 admission cycle really looks like. So let's get to it. Here's the real. The real of test optional. Everything you need to know about the role of standardized tests in the 2024-25 college admission cycle, and maybe more importantly, what to do about it. As we start, it's important to understand that there are two standardized tests that colleges could consider. One is the SAT, the other is the ACT. If a college is looking at your test scores, they'll take either one. It doesn't matter. Not that you need to know this, but I think it's important for the context to understand the standardized testing timeline and its use in college admissions. The SAT was originally launched in the 20s, followed by the ACT several decades later. Over this time frame, colleges were using both SAT and ACT data to make their decisions in terms of college admissions. In the early 1980s, an organization called the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, also known as Fair Test, was founded. They started to show that using SAT and ACT data may be biased. In fact, the data shows that it's biased towards those who speak English first. In other words, if you have trouble with the English language, you're going to have a hard time on the test. The data shows that higher scores go to families who come from higher income brackets, families who come from higher education, and there's some racial differences as well. They started to put out some serious reports and lobby against the use of the SAT and the ACT, favoring a more test optional, or what they would like to see as complete removal of the SAT and ACT in college admissions. So really, this test optional movement that we hear so much about right now started to gain steam in the 80s and continued in the 90s and the 2000s. It's important to note that around this time frame, Crosswalk started doing business in 2003, focusing on tutoring and test prep. We were watching this test optional movement. We knew it was happening. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, it was no surprise to us that all colleges went to test optional, namely because there weren't places to hold tests, so students couldn't take them. Coming out of the pandemic, it's kind of an interesting time. What we're seeing is a handful of schools are going back to test required, like they were decades ago. Handful of schools are actually saying, we're going to be test blind. We don't even want to talk about tests. But there's a majority of the schools, a big chunk of the population of schools are test optional. What we want to talk about right now is what that really means. Before I go any further, let me remind you that Crosswalk's been in business for a long time. And in fact, a blog post I had in 2016 shows that we were way in favor of test optional. Now, why would a test prep company be in favor of test optional? Does that sound ironic? No, not at all. In fact, what I argued at this point, this was using data from the FAIR test. What I argued then is making things test optional removes the stress. And what we've seen in our time tutoring test prep is that stress is the #1 driver of student disappointment, let's call it. I wouldn't even say anything beyond that. Students who are stressed about this test tend to perform poorly. Students who are not stressed tend to perform better. It's a pretty big generalization, but when we say test optional, and here I am in 2016 saying, hey, don't stress about this test, it shows that when you remove the stress, you can actually do better on the test. Now, a couple words I've thrown around, let's make sure we understand. Test blind. Like I mentioned before, test blind are schools who are not going to consider test scores at all during the admissions process. Test optional, what we're talking about right now, this is where the student has the option to submit or not submit a score. If a student submits it, the college will consider it. If they don't, they won't consider it, and there shouldn't be any penalization for not submitting a score. I'll talk about what that test optional really means in a moment. But before I do that, let's look at test required. Now, test required is like the olden days where a college will say, yes, you have to submit a test score, and yes, we will look at that test score in our process of admission. Now, the landscape today, here we are coming out of the pandemic, shows that really two extremes with a big chunk of schools in the middle. If we consider our y-axis as total number of colleges, there are very few who are test blind. I've listed a couple. Obviously, the big one, here I am in California locally, are the UCs. All schools in the UC system are test blind. Same with the CSUs. All schools in the California State University system are test blind. Another example is Reed College, but there's a small population of colleges who are and remain, and probably will be forever, test blind. On the other extreme, what we're seeing now in the most recent months actually is some schools are going back to test required. They are seeing that the data from standardized tests is helpful in their admissions decision. I listed Yale here. MIT was one of the first to come out of the pandemic and say they were test required. University of Texas of Austin just recently released their information that says they're going to do that. Dartmouth is another school that comes to mind. Brown is another school that comes to mind. Georgetown has been pretty much test required even through the test optional pandemic. They try to do as best they could. And so really what we're seeing here is a small pocket, but meaningful pocket. Notice the names I said, Yale, Dartmouth. These are Ivy League schools or near Ivy schools, schools who are highly selective, who can probably afford to be test required. Now, the big population right here, which we should all continue to be excited about, are all of the test optional schools. Again, it's the student's choice to submit a test score. In a moment, I will argue that I don't think test optional is actually the right naming of this thing. What I'll argue is it's submission optional. But before I get there, let's understand that most schools out there are test optional. That's pretty exciting, right? We get to kind of reduce the stress about the test. And if you can go ahead and get a good score, then submit it. And if you can't, then you can continue to focus on other parts of your college application that don't have anything to do with testing. However, I do want to point out this one thing. As optional as we say tests are, there is an argument that test scores, particularly good ones, can be a way to access more scholarship money and potentially more admissions chances. Let me go back to the organization I mentioned, Fair Test. They put out a report in 2023 called, quote, Merit, unquote, Award Myths and Barriers. There's a lot of good stuff in this report. Go ahead and read it. I've put the link there. But really, one of the key arguments that they argue is that they say, and here's their quote, in this speaking bubble here, quote, less than 1/5 of state-funded merit scholarship programs and 1/3 of institution-funded merit scholarships at state flagship universities require standardized test scores. This is a big argument. Great, less than 1/5, less than 1/3. So in their eyes, maybe you shouldn't have to take the test. And I may agree with that. However, this is my response to their argument. While I am a proponent of test optional, don't get me wrong, I look at this report and I say, well, wait a second. You're saying that 20 to 30% more scholarships go to students who submit scores? I mean, that's good math, right? 1/5 to 1/3, greater chance of getting scholarship. And what this report doesn't convince me is what happens to the private colleges. Both of these points here are about state-funded merit scholarships or institution-funded at state flagships. But what about private colleges? They're the ones that make up the bulk of those test optional schools. What's going on there? Here's the reality check for me. This is really about submission optional, because what we're seeing is, yes, more admission chances and more scholarship opportunities can go to students who submit test scores. Over the past couple of years, that's gone to students who submit scores. Now, those scores tend to be a little bit higher because in this submission optional landscape, students who get good scores are going to submit scores. But if we're talking about an increase of, at a minimum, 1/5 to 1/3 chances of scholarship, it might be a good idea to consider taking the test and then decide to submit. You should take the test, but maybe decide later if you want to submit. Now, if you're going to take the test, here's what we work on with our students. We walk them through this process of first understanding. That's that first step we're doing right now. Understanding that these scores may not be necessary. They can help, but they're definitely not necessary. What we then recommend our clients to do is to take a practice test. So those are things we can administer ourselves, or those are things you could do officially, or you could even do it on your own. You don't need to hire us to do it or anyone else to do it. You can download a practice test from the College Board website, which runs the SAT, or from the ACT Inc. website, which runs the ACT. You can score according to the instructions, it's all pretty self-explanatory, and figure out where your score would land. Once you've got that score, here's the big moment. Compare. How close is your score to the score of the schools you're considering applying to? Right? Now, that might be a little thing that you have to do before you do all of this, is come up with your list of schools and write down what SAT or ACT score are for those admitted students. But take your score, compare it to that score, and ask yourself, are you close or are you way off? And then you decide. If you're close, you can improve your score. Test taking is a skill. just like playing the guitar, just like playing tennis, just like speaking Spanish. All of these are skills, and you work at it, you get better. And if you want to do that work and you're close to that score, it's probably in your best interest to go for it. If you're not, then that's okay too. Two things happen there. Number one, you must limit your colleges to test blind or test optional. And number two, you let the other parts of your college application shine. Work on the essay, get good letters of recommendation, maybe work on your extracurricular activities, right? There's other things you can do. It doesn't necessarily have to be test scores. But again, if you're close, then it might be worth working at it and trying to get better. And what does that look like? Well, it's a cyclical process. This is exactly what we work on with our students. We have them take a practice test or an official one. That's step one. Get that score. That's step two. Now, analyze that score. Again, that's a comparison activity in which you say, what is the official score versus what is the goal score? I put a little asterisk down here just to remind you, the goal score is the score that's in the range of admitted students to schools of your choice. You analyze those results and you say, how close am I? You take that analysis a step further and you come up with a list of the questions that you got incorrect. And what you do is you start to categorize those questions. Give you an example. Let's say in a math section, you missed 5 questions. Look at all 5 questions that you missed and figure out what content area they're in. Let's say, for example, they're all graphing parabolas, right? You missed all of the graphing parabolas ones, right? Well, that brings us to step number 4. Because you've analyzed your results, because you figured out that you have a weakness, here at Crosswalk, we celebrate weaknesses. We say, yay, weakness, because weaknesses are an opportunity to get better. If you've got a couple weeks, you've got a couple months, you can get better at that thing. You can dive into YouTube, Khan Academy, ask a teacher, ask your friend, hey, can you teach me how to graph parabolas? I didn't get this problem. Can you help me out with that one? Right. You want to hire a tutor? We're here for that, but you don't have to. These are things that you can do on your own. Improve upon your weaknesses, and then you take the cycle all over again. Take another practice test, score it, analyze the results, improve on your weaknesses, and you keep going, right? The more results you have, the more data you have, the more you can identify weaknesses, the more ways you can target how to get better. And the more you do this cycle, the better you become at the tests, the more comfortable, the more confident, and most importantly, the less stressed you are about the whole process. It's a pretty simple process. It's what we do with our students. Now, one more thing before I wrap up here. For those of you that are looking at this SAT or ACT, it's important to note that there's some pretty significant differences. Both tests should be measuring the same thing. They're measuring your college readiness. Can you read? Can you write? That kind of thing. However, the format is a little bit different. Notice these sections. SAT is 2 virtual modules with 2 math modules. ACT is also 4 sections, but divided between English, math, reading, and science. Notice that math is half of your SAT. It's only 1/4 of your ACT. So if you're more math inclined, SAT might be better for you. If you're less math inclined, ACT might be better for you. This second section here is the scoring, is huge. Your SAT score is the sum of the verbal plus the sum of your math, all scaled to this 400 to 1600 scale. And ignore the scales for a moment. The scales don't really matter. It's the numbers, right? Notice that it's the sum. Whereas the ACT, it is the scaled score of your English plus math plus reading plus science divided by 4. So it's the average of the 4. Going back to that student who might be less inclined with math, let's say they get a really weak math score. If you get a good English, a good reading, and a good science, it can lift the whole entire score up. Again, if you're more math inclined, SAT. If you're less math inclined, ACT. Format's obviously a significant difference, particularly now the SAT, as of 2024, is rolling out with a digital test that's adaptive. Adaptive meaning you're on a computer, and if you get an easy question correct, you'll get a harder question to follow. And over the course of the test, you'll land in a place where they think you'll score. Versus the ACT, which is the old-fashioned paper, non-adaptive. Both tests have the same idea in the sense that there are a limited number of questions. So strategically, there's a certain number of answers that you should get correct. We can talk about that in terms of how you plan for that. But the idea that these formats are significantly different could favor particular students. If you're more of a paper old-fashioned, ACT is better for you. If you're not afraid to be on a computer and deal with the adaptive nature of the test, SAT could be better for you. Another significant difference is this one here. SAT, generally speaking, gives you more time per question, whereas the ACT is less time per question. If you are a slow mover through most tests, SAT is probably better for you. If you're not afraid to move quickly, ACT is better for you. What I tell students all the time, ACT questions, because there's less time per question, they're actually pretty relatively easier than the SAT. All things considered, right? And that might be differences of students and things like that. But because you have less time per question on the ACT, there's less of a harder kind of question that you might find on the SAT. Again, generally speaking. And the last point is really important to consider, especially out here in California. The geographic footprint of the SAT in California is pretty significant. It tends to be a little bit easier to find a registration spot for the SAT, particularly because a lot of schools now in my local area, I'm based in the 831 in the Monterey Bay area. Some of our local schools are actually hosting test days on their campuses. So schools will shut down for half a day and give all their juniors or their seniors the time to take the SAT. That's kind of a nice thing because when you register, you just go to your school, you know exactly where to go. Whereas the ACT, I just haven't seen that. And that might just be my local angle, but I just haven't seen that yet. So really both of them, you kind of have to look at which one you can register for. Now, one more thing before I move on, you see essays in parentheses on the ACT. ACT continues to offer the essay, although that's going away more and more. I won't spend any time on this one, but worth considering if you have a program or a school in mind that requires the essay, although I will say not many do. So maybe you don't have to do that, but kind of your call on that one. Now, let me wrap. If you like this and want to work with Crosswalk and want to improve your test score, what we're offering this summer is perhaps the best program we've ever offered. Again, we've been in this business since 2003, and it's taken me maybe 20 years to kind of really figure out what drives the needle with students. And this is it. It's a 4-session group class meeting once a week in July, followed by, or in conjunction with, 2 private sessions. What we see is my counterparts, let's say my competitors, if you will, are charging anywhere from $250 to $500 an hour for private sessions. And we know that private sessions move the needle, but we also know that all families can't afford that. We feel that we have a model that the 4 group classes that present the strategies, the content, all of the things that will boost your score, we can do that in a group format. They are in person or online. They'll be hosted in the Monterey Bay area. The sessions, on the other hand, if you miss, are recorded. So if you're traveling and can't Zoom in, or if for whatever reason you're sick, we will record the session and have it available for you to view later. If you can make it in person, great. Make it online, great. Watch the video after, that's fine too. The 2 private sessions will be scheduled by the student directly with me. Those will be with me. There'll be 1-hour meetings, most likely on Zoom, but I can do some in-person things depending on where you are. And we'll do them whenever you want. I will recommend and suggest and work with students to schedule one of those sessions in July, and then likely a session to follow up in August to make sure you're all set to get going on the rest of the summer and the school year. Because I'm offering the private sessions, space in this course is highly limited. These are smaller group courses. We really want to personalize and tailor the instruction to student needs. So if you want to check this out, get on this website, get on our website, crosswalkeducation.com/bookings. And if you're there, you may as well, this is what it looks like when you sign up. Check out our homepage. You can see we've got lots of good resources there for what we do at Crosswalk, blog posts, YouTube videos. And if you want access to all of those, obviously it's on the website, but enter your email here. You could subscribe to everything that we have to offer. So that way you keep informed of what's going on, what we're doing, what we're working on, and what's next for you. So thanks for tuning in. If you do want to work with Crosswalk, email me at contact@crosswalkeducation.com. Call me up 831-70-TUTOR or find us on the web at crosswalkeducation.com. Once again, I'm Brooke Higgins, lead instructor and founder of Crosswalk. Happy to help with you on your test taking journey.